Thank you ever so much for that introduction, John. This is a little bit of a trip down memory lane for me. As you just said, I graduated in '72. I'm in my early 70s now, and I thought that I would go back to the 1970s and tell you a little bit about my time in Morocco with other people. Trying to move on my screen. So it's adventures in Morocco more than anything, I suppose, and hopefully I can show you some of the personal side of fieldwork, which I enjoyed at the time. Now here's Morocco itself, and as you can see, we are dealing with the high Atlas Mountains that run all the way through from Algeria, Tunisia, up in the north, up in the northeast, all the way down to the town of Agadir, right down in the southern area of the coast. You can see the major towns in Tangier, Rabat, Casablanca, Marrakesh, but also to pick up some of the features of Beni Mellal and Ouarzazate in the high Atlas mountain range, which I'm outlining for you there. You'll see that the mountains themselves stretch for about 720 kilometers or so. And the relief of the area that I'm going to be dealing with was from about 500 meters, but to over 4,000 meters in some cases. And you'll see later on how the total exposure of the area was excellent for geological mapping. Now, the mountain folk of the area are, in fact, Berber tribesmen. They're not strictly Arabs, and they often have green eyes and light-coloured hair, often hennaed and coloured. But the Berbers themselves call the mountains the Idaran Daran, the mountain of mountains, and they speak a different dialect to the local Arabic. In front of you, you can see the general structure where we have the Rif and the Betex in Spain, the Sahara Atlas running down through to the High Atlas, the Western High Atlas on the corner here, and in between there's something called the Tichka Massif, and this is a Paleozoic massif on which the Liassic Sea that we'll see later on was able to feather out and wash against a Paleozoic massif. Probably it didn't get to the High Atlas, the Western High Atlas side, although there is an indication that there was a sea there, but that probably came in from the western side. Here's the general structure of my field area itself, and this is dominated really by the North Atlas Fault that runs through the major peaks of the area. Just to pick out Jebel Lazurki there, which is where I spent a great deal of my time. And the cross sections that you can see marked in here are where the rocks outcropped. We'll be looking at Liassic rocks, and you can see as we go across the cross sections that I've highlighted the color of my Liassic carbonates, and you can see that it's more or less thin and thick-skinned tectonics which were put together. The last phase, I suppose, of folding was right up at the end of the Oligocene, and then there was a general elevation during Pliocene and the Quaternary. But as you can see from the scale at the side there, a lot of the area that I was working in is high and up over 3,000 meters, sometimes to 4. Here are some of the cross sections of the area that I was working in. Again, you can see sort of the nature of the ground, and in some cases, the fault zones were in fact intruded by doleritic basalt, but that came along somewhat later. Here's a general shot, really, just to emphasize the field area and how it came onto the edges of the Tichka Massif again, just to emphasize that the Liassic transgression came in from the east. Here's a general shot of the area. You can see sort of the mountainous nature of the area itself, precipitous cliffs in many of the valleys and wadis. Here's a shot, a little bit washed out, I'm afraid, of the actual carbonates, the Liassic carbonates, up on top of the Titchgap Massif itself. The foreground shows, in fact, Silurian rocks up through into a little bit of Triassic, and then the Liassic carbonates on the top itself. Now, the rocks are all of Jurassic age, as we will hopefully see a little later. And these are the stages of the Jurassic, and we're looking down into the lower Jurassic, Liassic material, into a group of rocks designated as the Pliensbachian. And then looking down at the stages themselves, you'll see that the upper Pliensbachian in this case is called the Domerian. And these are the rocks which, with my colleagues, I was able to study. Now, stratigraphers never really agree on anything. And so sometimes the stages between these things are not quite the same. And so for the Domerian section itself, we used the classification of Haig back from the 1910 or so. And that was done because these maps that we were dealing with were all mapped by Moroccan and French geologists, and this was the standard classification that they used on all of their maps until about 1962 or so. Now, French geologists often say that they map chronostratigraphically. They say that they map time zones, but strictly speaking, in some cases, it really is a lithostratigraphical mapping technique. And you can see here that there is often a major scarp at the junction between different sections. Down here is the lower Pliensbachian, and up above we have the thick sequence of carbonates from Domerian rocks. Now, the background to the area itself obviously goes way back into the opening of the Atlantic, when this part of Morocco was governed by changes in the west, where the Atlantic is opening out. And in my part of the field area, during Liassic times, the area was dominated by slip or bleak slip, sort of pull-apart basins, which were associated with the spreading. And in these basins, the Liassic Sea then transgressed in from the Tethys area into the western part of the High Atlas. These structural trends, though, were also propagated through from the basement, where we have basement structures of horsts and graubens, which then affected the material being deposited on top. And so there are individual changes in thicknesses in association with this massif and the effect of the Atlantic producing horsts and graubens and fault zones, which often were self-perpetuated throughout time. So as we go through the sequence, we can see here a shot across the desert surface. You see the village at the bottom for scale. Up through the sequence, we have Triassic material, and then right on the very top, we have the Triassic junction, and then the Liassic carbonates as part of the initial transgression into the area. These are the way in which the lineaments and the structural trends were propagated into the field area. And you see that there appears to be a northeast, southwest horst and grauben type structure, which was influencing sedimentation as the transgression moved in. And just to show that these things were still actually affecting Triassic and certainly Liassic material. This is an isopachite, a thickness map across the field area. And you can see to the north of the North Atlas Fault that there is a thickening of sequence right up to the fault itself. And these were produced by measured sections which were across the area. This is perhaps a wee bit easier to see, in which you can see where the measured sections are seen along the top, and then the fault zone itself with thick sections on the northern side and somewhat thinner on the over the top of the horsts. There was a slight alignment which was being produced also in a different direction, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now here's the area itself, 27 measured sections. And what I've tried to show here is that in most cases there were paved roads through into the northern area and into the southern area, the mountains in between. The bits marked in blue, these are just the back roads, the piste, the unpaved material. But in some cases, even that wasn't good enough. And there were 2 mule excursions into the mountains to measure the sections. And we'll have a little look at those a bit later on, and hopefully will make you smile when we have a look at my 1970 persona. These are some of the gorges to the south. This is the Todra Gorge to the south, which gave us access to the mountains through Ouarzazate. And here's the Dades Gorge, which again gave us access, in some cases with vehicles, but mostly by mule. Here's the field area. I thought you'd like to, the field party. I thought you'd quite like to see this. This is my 1972 look, as you can see. The field party in the back there with Barbara Ennis and Christopher Burgess, and my girlfriend at the time, later my wife, sitting next to me. And just really to pay tribute to the man on the immediate right-hand side, Derek Ager. Now, Derek Ager was a fantastic geologist. He was a really thoroughly good man and taught me a lot about geology, gave me an excellent geological education, but also a lot about life, actually. And he also gave me, as I went through life, a great liking for Chateauneuf-du-Pape, creme caramels, and strong cheese. He was a mentor that was second to none. And I remember Derek Ager, the late great Derek Ager, very fondly. This is the countryside that we were operating in. You can see quite barren, almost total outcrop. And these were the areas where we were able to camp on occasions, usually in tents. And just to show you our field vehicle, which was the Renault 4. Now, the Renault 4, probably pound for pound, is the best field vehicle I've ever been in at all. On one occasion, we were in a mountain souk, and a camel actually sat on the front of the car. And because of that, it caved in the bonnet, which meant we couldn't change gear, as it was a push and pull gear stick. But we just opened up the bonnet and banged it out with our hammers and drove off again. It was just a perfect field vehicle. In some cases, though, you had to be a wee bit careful. This is where I was camping way out up on the top of Jebel Azurki on my own. And one evening, after an evening meal that I'd cooked on a camping gas stove, I thought I'd write up my notes, but it was getting quite dark. And so I thought I'd better have a light as well, so that I could see what I was doing. But as I started to put the top of the light into the gas cylinder, I took it too close to the gas which I'd already been cooked on, and a flame jumped across from one to the other, and a flame shot into the air from the gas cylinder. It was about 10 feet high. Took most of my facial hair off at the time, but it was one of those cautionary tales, and I don't think I've ever used Calagas again. If we didn't stay in our own tents, we sometimes were able to stay with our Berber compatriots up in the mountains. These are quite comfortable, in fact. This is just a classic mountain tent with goats and people and everybody sleeping together, but very, very convivial atmosphere. Sometimes we were a little bit on the posh side. We were able to stay in the Caid's house. This is the Caid of 8 bugmares, and we were able to stay in a stone house. Usually we would sleep up on the roof under the stars. Now, on occasions, we were able to swap our Renault 4s and go into Land Rovers. Now, this is, in fact, the Swansea Geophysical Land Rover, which we drove all the way from Swansea via the High Atlas to Agadir and back. It had the advantage that we were able to take our rock samples back with us. But again, a little anecdotal story that all the samples we were able to slab in the Geological Survey offices in Rabat, and we took slabbed all our samples into sort of matchbox size samples and wrapped them in newspaper and then stuck them with sellotape. But of course, we had a major problem going through Spanish customs because they were about the size that hashish is smuggled back through, and we had to open them all up again before we were able to go through. It took us hours and hours to move through the customs. Now, on occasions, we weren't able to go by road, and so we took to mule. Here you can see the field party right up in the foreground here. There's Derek Ager, Chris Burgess and his girlfriend Barbara. The girls were with us for a summer holiday. And this is my wife Irene at the back. Derek always used to tease my wife and say that she was the only Swansea student that he knew who went into the field with a hammer, a compass clinometer, and a large bottle of Chanel No. 5. He used the pictures in some of the covers and promotional material. This is us on the front of his book on new catastrophism. This is Jebel Timaratine in the background. Again, 3 of the field party with a close-up over here. The next one I'm going to show you, I prefer, as this was promotional material for Swansea University itself. You can see University College Swansea at the bottom, and that's me in true Clint Eastwood mode, as you can see on the front there. And what you can't really see at the other side is there is a pannier, just like this, which has a live goat that we took with us. And I got quite close to this goat over the couple of days that we were moving along. But you'll see what happened to him a little later. Now, we took everything with us. This is the making of bread up in the mountains there, just simply unleavened bread, cooked on the coals. But as we know, man can't live by bread alone. And so that goat I told you about was dispatched in the correct halal way and then skinned. The skin was kept for a water container, and then we feasted on various parts of the goat's anatomy for the next few days. Mostly delicious, but and I have a pretty strong stomach. But one morning for breakfast, they produced goat stomach lining, tripe as we'd know it, wrapped up with intestines and then boiled up for breakfast, which I must admit, that was just a little bit too much for me. Even though when we'd finished our breakfast, we had to get to the top of the section. And so we were camping down on the lower parts of the internal graubuns, and then we'd hike up to measure the sections through the sequence itself. Sometimes, however, when we weren't walking, we also then went by bicycle. Raindrops, in fact, didn't fall on my head here as we're in August, but it gives you an idea of the type of transport we were able to use. This was hired from a local shop, and none of the bikes there had brakes at all. So we were able to get around without too much of a problem. Now here's the ubiquitous Cameo De Montagna that you find right through all areas of the high Atlas Mountains. And this is a sort of a half full wagon with people on the top, and you could probably get anything that you required from one of these moving shops. Now here's the background of the field area itself. The rocks themselves, as you can see, in this case, are relatively steeply dipping Liassic carbonates, Domerian carbonates. This is Jebel al-Zurqi, and we are up well over 3,000 meters, and we're looking at the top here from mid-August, and you can see the snow is still here on the northern sides, but it does give you an idea of true almost 100% outcrop. As we moved over the top of this ridge, we were able to come to some of the central Graubens. This is the valley of 8 Bougmeres, the children of Bougmeres, where we stayed for an extended time. Often Shangri-La we referred to, as it was a lovely place to stay after being up in the mountains themselves. And this had a community all of its own, and we were invited in here and accepted quite readily, and attended various functions and weddings and those sorts of things. And the Berber people really looked after us well. Now let's have a look at the bivalves themselves, which is sort of the main part of the title of the talk. Here you'll see the bivalves stretching all the way up to over, in some cases, 50 centimeters long, very, very robust valves, huge calcite valves. They are extremely robust in the sense that the valves themselves are really thick. One valve is really thick, and one valve is somewhat thinner. But there is no sort of equivalent to these in the present day. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this, but I'm going to hold up. I don't know whether this is will work, but I've got an oyster here. This is a modern oyster, and you can see it's about 10 centimeters long. And if you think of that as the a comparison to some of these oyster-like forms, you can see that it's somewhat different. Now, the oysters themselves were part, or oyster-like creatures, I should say, were part of a facies, which was called the Lithiotus facies, and it was made up of various large, robust bivalve structures, which, in the list that you can see there, made up most of the rock types we'll have a little look at. The top two, Lithiotus problematica and Cochlearites lopianus, were the two major ones which were going to make up the reef structures that we're going to look at. The others underneath, with Geophysical, Mytiloperna and Lithioperna, they were somewhat subsidiary in my area, but there was a large, robust form called Opisoma, again, which we'll come back and we'll have a little look at as we go along. Lithiotus problematica and Cochlearites are the type of bivalves which occur right across the southern Tethys, and they seem to be intertidal, shallow subtidal in origin, and they're associated with tidal flats and swampy areas and distributary tidal channels. Here's the actual cross-section of one of these beasts. This is the robust shell with the major hinge zone and ligament zone here, the single muscle scar. And on the side here, you can see some crosses through this structure where you get the various sequences of cross-section of the bivalve itself. And you can see that these can be very, very variable indeed. And if you then think of many, many oblique cuts across these structures, then you can see that they can be very complicated to work out in the field. Here's some field shots, hammer for scale. You can see the robust nature of the valves themselves, and these often constituted many, many thousands of shells within the sequence. And again, just for scale, with boots there, you can see some of the very strange type of structures and cross sections that you were able to pick up. Here are some, which again, hopefully is not too overexposed, but these are some Lithiotus shells in life position, growing up vertically at right angles to the growing surface. In this case, they are dolomitized, which lets them stand out somewhat from the background lithology. Very strange structures, though, on occasions. You're never quite sure what you're looking at because the valves themselves are often difficult to work out. Here's a Lithiotus itself. You can see again the cross sections that you can pick up in the bedding, the thin shell on one side and the much thicker shell, which made up the robust side of things. When you then put these together, this is Lithiotus and this is Costliarites on this side. The only way you can tell them apart, in fact, is by differences in the hinge zone. And so it's very difficult sometimes to tell them apart. But some of our Italian colleagues, some of the Italian workers, they came up with the conclusion that if you were able to pick up the hinge zone of one of these bivalves, and you were able to identify that hinge zone within a bed. This is a bedding surface, and this is the actual bed itself on this side with the various silhouettes of the valves. You were able to say that it was an exclusively distributed group, where if you were able to find one hinge zone, most probably all of those animals, all of those bivalves would be of the same type. In this case, this bed, all of these animals were in fact Costliarites. Here's a shot to show the growth structure. You can see the scale at the top and the way that they move up. They cement together and they tend to move up away from each other, and they cement and move away. And in some cases, they often look like sort of bunches of bananas, but these are large valves all cemented together in growth position. Sometimes the individual silhouettes had sort of quite an iconoclastic view to them, and they were always often quite difficult to work out. But in this case, you're able to see something which the French geologists know or call a gendarme's moustache. You can see the way in which the two valves are fitted together, and it's a classic sort of silhouette of the high atlas bivalve beds. Now, the actual facies itself, it forms on the edge of the tethys. There are some deposits of Lithiotus type facies in Oregon, down here in South America, but mostly through North Africa, through Spain, Italy, down through the Middle East, a little bit in East Africa, but also quite interestingly over here in Timor. And they seem to have been facies which developed and then became extinct in Middle Jurassic times and just died out. But why they are there and why they make the forms that they do, it may have something to do with the lack of framed coral forming organisms at that time, but we'll perhaps come back to that a little later. In some cases, there are some bivalves in the area which are called megalodontids, and these are usually characterized in a different way to the Lithiotids and the Costliaritids, and they usually have this heart shape, which is like a cloven hoof. And these are then a relatively easy way of telling megalodontid bivalves from the others. Now, the structure that we were able to work to, or the model, is based on the standard model of shallow carbonates, where we would have a desert or supratidal area on shore, and then through intertidal, through subtidal open marine. And you can see the two models which are presented in most general textbooks. This is the arid model, usually based on the Trucial coast of Abu Dhabi, and this is the humid model based on the Bahamas. The difference is the amount of rainfall, but I think what you are able to pick out is that there are well-defined areas of supratidal, intertidal, and subtidal, often crossed by tidal channels. I think my model was somewhere in between these two, not as arid as the arid model and not as humid as the humid model. But let's have a little look at those as we go along. Here are some of the maps that we were able to produce from our measured sections. You can see the positive areas coming out from the Titchka Massif. The Liassic transgression came in from the east and then produced various embayments, supratidal in yellow, intertidal and shallow subtidal in white, and then the open marine area out here to the east. And a series of maps will just show you how these developed through time. This is the middle Domerian, where we were able to still see supratidal, intertidal, and open marine to the east. But there's also some indication in these beds that there were some little tidal deltas here, flood and ebb tidal deltas, which were produced at the mouth of some of the tidal channels which were crossing the intertidal area. And as you see, we move on through time. We were able to pick up similar features as the supratidal area is still with embayments and irregular sections, but also up here, they're starting to get in the upper Domerian a little bit of an indication of cross beds, which perhaps was a new light shoal out on perhaps an edge into the open water. The final shot of these is really just to show you how during very uppermost Domerian time, the supratidal zone was prograding into the open water on the eastern side. And this is sort of typical of areas of carbonate deposition, just like the Abu Dhabi region of the Arabian Gulf. Here's a shot of Abu Dhabi. This is the SWGA, just to give you an idea that what we were looking at. Very, very low flats, some areas of standing water which would then evaporate away, but subject to high tides, storm tides, but also subject to a great deal of evaporation. And here's another shot taken out from the area of Abu Dhabi, where you can see some of the background sedimentation on the SWGA, the supratidal and intertidal flat, with areas of water, and then evaporites forming as ridges in some of the open water, but also as displacement gypsum within the bed itself. This is just a shot to take you back into how the conditions would have looked in Liassic times. Now, the area itself is it's dominated really by algal material. These are algal mats, algal mounds, which are produced as the algae itself, because conditions of salinity are very high, is not eaten by gastropods. The algae is able to grow on the surface. Sediment then washes in, it's bound into the algal filaments and then preserved in these mounds. Often called stromatolites, but sometimes the stromatolites themselves have individual names, but here this is just a wavy form which is sort of everywhere across the field area. You can see here again some of the features of the algal material, where it goes up and over into mounds and then waves off into another mound over here. Perhaps you could refer to these as stromatolites, but all I want you to have a look at, if you're able to see, is the crinkly nature of quite a lot of this sedimentation. You can see the little bumps and blisters and crinkles, which is an indication that some of this algal mat was in fact starting to be desiccated and dried out. Here's the background sedimentation. You can see it's well laminated, little packets of sedimentation across the tidal flats themselves. And what I thought I would try to do is to show you a similar sequence. Hopefully that's easy for you to see. This is the intertidal area in Florida, which again gives you the idea of little packets of sedimentation produced in quite good laminations, and then with algal material binding it together. So that's a modern shot from Florida, and that's the rock in the field. And you can see uniformitarianism is alive and well. Now, often the algal mats themselves become desiccated. You start to see that some of them start to move into these uprising areas of teepee structures, just like an American teepee where things are desiccated up. In some cases, they actually pass over each other. And so you can see there's expansion as the mineralization takes place. Again, down here, all the way through the area, you see the crinkly nature and the blister nature of some of the algal mat material. Now, if I remember correctly, here's a shot from, again, the Abu Dhabi region, where you can see a modern version of that crinkled and blistered algal mat. Here, quite nicely mud cracked. And you can also see the overlap of some of these structures forming into teepee structures, where you can see that it is cracked, first of all, and then the evaporation has caused crystal growth, and these surfaces grow over each other. So you can see there a modern equivalent of the ancient deposit. Now, in some cases, the desiccation got so that we produced what's known as bird's eye porosity, lots of tiny little spaces that you can see throughout the sedimentation and the bedding, often called, as I say, bird's eye or fenestral porosity. But also they're starting to become true carbonate soils. And in some cases, the porosity is sufficiently good that it can contain hydrocarbons. This is a photomicrograph, just a couple of millimeters across. You can see the background sedimentation here and the open spaces of the fenestral porosity. In this case, it's been dyed with alazarin red S and for potassium ferricyanide to dye the calcite pink, but to leave the dolomite rhombs that you can see just starting to appear in some cases without any color. And so dolomitization was a pervading factor across these rocks. And in most cases, most of the rocks show dolomitization in various forms. But this is quite an interesting porosity because it has been known to contain hydrocarbons elsewhere. Similarly, again, we start to get areas which are true soils where we have individual grains which start to appear. We get piezolyths forming here. We get the bird's eye porosity and quite a lot of coated grains, which is characteristic of carbonates soil horizons. This is just a photomicrograph to show you one of these grains, which then has an individual coating across the bottom. Again, true caliche soil horizons with piezolytic caliche in between, and then thick carbonate crusts on the most desiccated SWGA surface. And again, just a quick shot to show you the porosity produced in the background. Now, desiccation was all the way across these, from the supertidal into the intertidal, really good cross sections and really good plan views of desiccated algal mat in mud cracks. And in some cases, again using uniformitarianism principles. This is a shot I took of mud cracks in my back garden, just to show how the mud itself cracks, but then forms these individual chips and desiccation fragments, which are then incorporated in the sedimentation when the new sedimentation is produced on top. And here you can see some of these intraformational breccias and conglomerates, which are in fact where the material has been desiccated, desiccation chips occur, and then it's incorporated into the rocks, which subsequently follow. And in some cases, we even have what's known as edgewise conglomerates, where we have individual particles of rock which are derived from immediately the rocks beneath where they've been desiccated and then subsequently incorporated. Now, before we move on to the reefs themselves, this is really just a time to think about the subtidal and the intertidal as being relatively arid, some sort of evaporite producing dolomitization. But as we move out now, we go into the intertidal area where we start to pick up what we talked about in the title of the talk. These are the bivalve reefs and mounds of Jebel Arzurki. Now here's one in black and white that you can see 10 meters in size, almost total outcrop. And with that, we were able to do this type of thing. The individual bivalves themselves would form in a little growth structure within the mounds. On subsequent, as they died and then fell into the system, they would make up flank beds on either side. And in some cases, they were cut by the tidal channels that you can see in between. And in some cases, the mounds themselves also incorporated, especially on the bigger tidal channels, the valves took on an oblique view, all stacked on top of each other, and they constituted sort of epsilon crossbeds, which made up the point bars as these tidal flats moved through. And so you can see in some cases that there was a calcareous cross-bedded sandstone over the top, which was produced by many of the deltas, and there were lots of bands of oncolites, which are algal biscuits or algal spherules, which are produced by movement back and forth of the algal material. Right at the base, there was a burrowed sequence, and the burrowed sequence itself is seen here. You can see that there obviously were other animals living in the environment and burrowing around in the top of the tidal intertidal flat. Here are some of the bigger ones. You can see here again that we were able to, with very good exposure, to have large tidal channels moving through with the growth position of the Lithiotids and Costolarites living and producing mounds. And then as they become eroded, they then move into epsilon crossbeds on the edges of the channels themselves. Again, just a background shot, that final shot that I showed you, if I go back to that one, this structure here is in fact this one here. So you can see that they, in some cases, stick out quite nicely, but that was not always the case. Through the intertidal area, absolutely pervasively bioturbated, lots of creatures around. And as you would expect, bioturbation throughout the area. Here's the model itself that was put together by some Italian workers, principally a chap called Bossellini. And you can see that as we go through an X and Y cross section, we can see the growth of the bivalves, the epsilon crossbeds in the point bars to the tidal flats, and then throughout the succession, little mounds associated within or on the edge of the tidal channels as they moved through the intertidal area. And so it gives you an idea of the background to where these bivalves were forming reefs, or mounds, or biostromes, or bioherms. Just to go back to our model, if you can imagine the tidal channels moving through the intertidal area, on the edges of these, you would have a sequence of bivalve mounds and biostromes, bioherms, which are associated with the intertidal area itself. And sometimes, right at the mouth, we'd have the tidal deltas, the ebb and the flood tidal deltas, which are in close association with the bivalves themselves. Here are the ebb tidal deltas, cross-bedded oolites in a classic cross-bedded form. Again, cross-beds moving away from you, just to show the close proximity in this case to a lithioted bearing bed here, and then the cross-bedded oolites on the top. In some cases, quite interestingly, the cross-beds themselves were alternatively dolomitized. So here you can see almost a classic herringbone type cross-bedding situation. The light material is dolomite, the darker material is limestone calcite. So probably to do with porosity values, but as the dolomitizing fluids moved through, they picked out the areas which were the easiest to dolomitize. And these are the micrites, these are the oolites themselves. And as they were in such close proximity to the algal material of the tidal flats, you often find that the oolites themselves lose their structure and are micritized. They're micritized by the algal material boring into the outside and taking the structure out. Here you can see one which is not too bad, but in some cases, the structure is almost completely destroyed by algal burrowing. And here again, another shot really just to show you the close proximity of the bivalve beds with the cross-bedded material over the top. So a close association between the two things. Now, as we move out into the subtidal, we move out into the east and we start to pick up much more subtidal conditions and also some bigger structures. Now, no scale on this, unfortunately, but I'll come back to it in a moment. This is a reef structure which is developed in the subtidal area. And here you can see the material itself. Land Rover here for scale to give you an idea of how big it is. And you can see here is the shoalwood side, and here's the open water side. And you can see the structure itself coming down with a scarp and then shales to the seaward side. The overall structure here is made up of bivalves, some minor corals and gastropods and other things, but the major sequence is made up of bivalves. In this case, those ones we talked about, Opisoma. Now here's an analysis of the structure, and you can see that it started off down here in a little mound and then moved up through beds where the bivalves weren't too well developed, but there were megalodontids and there were stromatoporoids and various other things into true well-stocked bivalve beds until finally we come up through these Opisoma, which were probably more subtidal, into the very top where we have our Lithiotids, Cochleuaritids again, and presumably the water was shallowing to allow these to develop on the top. But you can see in this case, a true reef structure, a solid reef structure made up almost entirely of robust bivalves. At the frontier, we see a little bit of more diversification, and we see also some very few fasciculate corals, hardly any at all, but then some of the breccia beds, which you would expect on the seaward side. Here's just a shot to show the diversity, lots and lots of gastropods, as you can see, lots and lots of brachiopods and an open water fauna. And again, the bivalves towards the front tend to get smashed up somewhat as the water was, as the waves presumably were crashing against the structure. This is a wee bit hard to see. I hope that you'll be able to pick it out, but these again are dolomitized lithioid shells right up on the very, very top of the structure. If you then have a think about the actual development, we can see that bed by bed by bed, we have a structure at the front and a back area where the bivalves were growing, until finally we have the true structure, which is separating off the shoreward side from the seaward side. And then it was finally capped off with an oolite tidal shoal system, which came over the top. What I was never able to work out, because the exposure didn't allow it, was whether this structure, this reef structure, was a continuous structure on the edge of perhaps a ramp or on the edge of some sort of break, and whether these oolites were just not over the top, but perhaps were in between as well, as we see on coral reefs. Now, sometimes it's hard to think about how these looked. Well, these are the oolites themselves. Again, you can see in this case that these are open marine oolites, and you can see there's very little microtization of the structures. So we're away from the tidal flat, and we get less influence of the algal material destroying the structures. Here's a shot of a modern day coral reef in this case, but just really I wanted you to take your imagination away to think that these would have been the background shoreline deposits, then hopefully a lagoon through, and then a break where the reef structure interrupts into the deeper water to the east in this case. Now this is a coral, this is a representation of a coral reef, but you can imagine that bivalve reef could have made a similar structure in the Liassic seas. As you move out into deeper water again, the ammonites start to come in, and we get a relatively good open marine fauna. Again, bioturbation all the way through here, just to show good subtidal conditions. And then finally, when we get way out into the deepest water succession of all, we start to pick up these calciturbidites, which are very fine-grained, micritic, laminated material with some radularian cherts to show the deepness, and good pelagic faunas, ammonites and some pelagic crinoids, and also open marine faunas. So as we've moved across now way out into the deeper water, we can see that the conditions have changed. These, in fact, calciturbidites are graded, and these are individual bands which must have moved down a slope which was there, coarser at the bottom and then a wee bit finer at the top. But good ammonite faunas in this, for which we can do the correlation. Now, I suppose we have to ask ourselves, what was this all about? Well, it is about oil exploration, isn't it? In those days, in the 70s, it was really about oil exploration models. And when we look back at the material, we're able to see, in fact, that we do have structures, large reef-like structures, as I say, Land Rover here for scale, the front of the structure itself, and you can see also to seaward the accumulation of shales. The shales themselves develop off out into the deeper water and were relatively organic rich, so could have formed the potential source rocks for any potential oil exploration targets. But as we go into the other portions of the things you need, the things you need for oil exploration, you need reservoirs. Well, we do have reservoirs. We've seen the oolites, which would give good porosity. We had porosity also in the supratidal zone, in the bird's eye. And we then have, even in some cases, hard structures, which may not have been reservoirs in themselves, but may have been sufficiently rigid to cause an updoming over the top to produce anticlines for oil accumulation. So we start to see that the model itself works out for oil exploration that possibly in the subsurface could have been exploited. Now, we go through to the end, I suppose, and it's just a question now of thanking people for my time in Morocco. They were lovely people, the Berbers. Again, remember them very fondly indeed. They treated me very well, looked after me very well. And I was always struck by the fact how cheerful they were and how clean they were. They always stayed so often pristinely clean in the upper parts of the mountains. Here you can see some lovely little girls here with a baby on the back with hennaed hair. And just to show you how nice and clean and tidy they were, on to my last slide where I can finish, just to show you that this wasn't always the case. And unfortunately, Western geologists don't always stay as clean as they might. And that's just a shot to finish off to show how I looked in the 1970s. I'm a lot slimmer and with a lot more hair there. But that brings me to a close. And so just before I say bye, it's just a question of saying thank you ever so much for your support during my time as president. And thank you ever so much. I've enjoyed it. Okay, bye for now.